Welcome, everyone, to this very important and timely event. I first want to recognize the organizers, which include Howard University, Morehouse School of Medicine, Meharry Medical College, Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, National Medical Association and the Cobb Institute, the National Black Nurses Association and the National Urban League, and BlackDoctors.org. So good evening. Thanks for joining us for a very important discussion. Tonight's event was put together by the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, an organization that is doing very critical work to support the health and safety of the Black community during this unfortunate pandemic. The other organizations involved in tonight's dialogue, as I mentioned, have really committed lots of resources and time to making sure that we get the solutions to this pandemic right in the Black community. I want to also take the opportunity to thank the organizing committee from Howard University and NIH, in particular, Dr. Sandra Crew, the Dean of Social Work, Dr. Toyin Tafade, the Dean of the College of Pharmacy, Dr. Celia Maxwell, the Associate Dean of the College of Medicine, and Dr. Christine Grady of the National Institutes of Health, who have worked tirelessly in the initial conceptualization of this important program. We look forward to continuing to partner with NIH in the development of future programs and activities. There's so many individuals on the front lines helping individuals and communities get through this pandemic. We cannot forget to thank them and to offer our thanks and our prayers to them and their families in this upcoming holiday season. We are very committed to bringing the experts to the Black community so that all African Americans can benefit from the information and insight. It is clear that the pandemic has disproportionately affected the Black community in particularly, not just through infection rates and mortalities, but the ensuing recession as well. And so we must recognize that these individuals have continued to go to work, have continued to stock our grocery stores, have continued to supply services, have continued to offer rides in taxis and other types of vehicles to allow us to continue to live our lives with some modicum of normalcy, while they themselves have been put at risk. So we need to counteract the efforts to sow any doubt and confusion by elevating facts and information within our community. What are the concerns? Well, historically, the Black community has not had access to the same quality of healthcare. There is distrust for institutions among the Black community that could undermine efforts to ensure widespread vaccination. And we have to recognize that while most of this may be distrust for the health community, some of it is underpinned by some concerns about other institutions in our society, such as law enforcement. And so tonight we hope to get on a road and on a path to making sure that everybody has the facts and that everybody can understand what we must do with respect to participating and using data. As a cancer surgeon myself, I understand the importance of research and how it can influence successful health outcomes. I'm particularly excited tonight to have Dr. Fauci with us. When you need someone to give it straight, Dr. Fauci is who you want. So I want to thank you, Dr. Fauci, for speaking with us tonight and for your tireless efforts for decades to protect the health and safety of American citizens. At a time when all of us needed information and honesty, you have been an advocate of unyielding truth. I also want to congratulate you on today's appointment, as it were, by President-elect Biden to continue to be the trusted physician that we will continue to have. Scrolling across the bottom of the screen and typed into the chat room, we will provide information on how you can access our websites and important information about connecting with experts about enrolling in clinical trials. So with that said, let's get started. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Siham Majoo, an assistant professor in the Howard University College of Medicine and a consultant in the Infectious Disease Division of the Howard University Hospital Department of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Majoo.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Dr. Frederick, for the nice introduction. And it's an honor to be with you on the show and with Dr. Fauci. I am one of numerous scientists and clinical researchers at African American health institutions. We are very proud of the research we do and the standards under which that research is conducted. It's very important that people of color participate in clinical research because they have been disproportionately affected during this pandemic. It's also very important that you know that all of our institutions have signed a special pledge of commitment to you regarding the trustworthiness of how we conduct research. You can find the pledge by going to Black Coalition Against COVID.org, which is scrolling at the bottom of the screen. Also, as Dr. Frederick has mentioned during the show, we will scroll information informing you where you can explore whether you would like to enroll in a clinical trial for COVID-19 vaccine. Thank you very much.
I'm also excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Christine Grady. She is the Chief of the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center. Dr. Grady's area of focus includes clinical research ethics, including informed consent, vulnerability, study design, recruitment, and international research ethics, as well as the ethical issues faced by nurses and other healthcare providers. So we are very thankful for the work that she does, and we're thankful you can join us tonight, Dr. Grady.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frederick, and good evening to everybody. As you heard, I'm an ethicist at the NIH. My colleagues and I, and ethicists in many other places, are intensively involved in thinking about the ethics of vaccine research, vaccine prioritization and distribution and utilization, community engagement, and other things. We're also very committed to the ethical conduct of research that respects the dignity, the value, and the worth of all people, and certainly including African Americans and people of color. We look forward very much to listening and learning this evening from the comments, suggestions, and questions that the audience brings tonight. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce and then turn over the program to Ambrose Lane, who epitomizes the model of informed and principled community-based health leadership. Ambrose Lane Jr. has over 35 years of leadership experience as an effective organizer and executive. Mr. Lane is the founder of, and since 2013, the chairman of the Health Alliance Network, DC's largest community health advocacy group, advocating for issues of health equity, health policy, and chronic disease prevention strategies. He is also a co-founder of the Black Coalition Against COVID. Ambrose, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grady, for that introduction. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Anthony S. Fauci for our audience. Dr. Anthony S. Fauci is director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, where he oversees an extensive research portfolio focused on infectious and immune-mediated diseases. As the longtime chief of the NIAID Laboratory of Immunoregulation, Dr. Fauci has made many seminal contributions in basic and clinical research and is one of the world's most cited biomedical scientists. He was one of the principal architects of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a program that has saved millions of lives throughout the developing world. Most recently, he has led the U.S. government COVID-19 research effort and served on the White House Coronavirus Task Force. And on behalf of the Black Coalition Against COVID, Howard University, the Health Alliance Network, and BlackDoctor.org, and other organizations, we welcome you, Tony. How are you?
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Lane. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I look forward to the dialogue and the discussion. The comments that we heard from Dr. Frederick ring also true for those of us who are deeply involved in addressing this COVID-19 challenge that we're facing. And that is the very painful disparity, not only in incidence and prevalence of COVID-19 disease among African Americans and people of color, but also the disproportionate burden of serious disease as reflected in increased hospitalizations to the tune of 4 times the number of hospitalizations per 100,000 population among African Americans compared to the population in general, and at least twice as many deaths. These are things that relate to so many factors that I hope we get a chance to discuss this evening so that we could learn from you and do better in how we address so many of these difficult issues that are right now, I believe, at the forefront of what we are obligated to do with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll stop there and be happy to engage in discussion with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for making time to really talk to and have a conversation with the Black community. And one thing that I have learned in terms of some poll taking, even though there is some trepidation of African Americans in terms of taking the vaccine or participating in vaccine trials, still African Americans do trust Dr. Fauci. And so that's actually a very good sign. So I want to start off by letting you know that a lot of African Americans do trust because you're very forthright based on science, and we try to follow the science. However, I do want to put some things into context as we start our conversation. A very recent Pew Research poll and other polls taken, so for example, BlackDoctors.org also took a poll on their website, but they have indicated a reluctance by the Black community to participate in vaccine trials or to take the vaccine once it is available. The immediate question is around mistrust. Mistrust of the state, mistrust of white people, mistrust of the medical community, and so on. You generally hear of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and Henrietta Lacks, but it is rooted much deeper. From slavery to Jim Crow, to the targeting of Black leaders in the 60s, to police brutality and uneven court justice, to Black Lives Matter, and now to the disproportionate impact of COVID on the Black community. While at the same time, there is recognition of Black progress made in society, not just in arts, entertainment, and sports, but also in education, business, and science. The poll shows an almost even split between Black people who will take the vaccine and those that won't. And it cuts across economic position. In addition to all of those issues, all of the peeling back that layer of the onion, the whole country has been fed misinformation and sometimes outright lies about COVID-19 and vaccination. So my first question, which is a tough question, is why should Black people trust this process?
Well, Ambrose, I think the first thing that we need to appreciate, those of us who are trying to convince our African-American brothers and sisters to trust the process, because it's ultimately to the benefit of the life and safety of the individuals, as well as your families and your entire community, is that to first understand the reasons and empathize with the reasons for the mistrust, as opposed to pushing back against the mistrust. And one of the ways that I try to do it is to try and dissect out not the fundamental core of the distrust, but take the particular situation you're dealing with now and say, let's try and start off on an even footing. What are the reasons for this particular situation, namely the vaccine, that you have reluctance and skepticism about getting vaccinated? And I think there are two major issues that when I explain them to my friends and colleagues and people who I don't know in the African American community and the community of people of color, is that the speed with which this was done. Isn't there something reckless about that? Well, the first thing is to point out that the speed has nothing to do with compromising safety or scientific integrity. It's due to the extraordinary and exquisite advances in vaccine platform technology, which has allowed us to do things in weeks to months that formerly took years, several years, and to engage in a dialogue and talk about that as opposed to just feeding it to them. The second thing is, well, how do I know that this vaccine is really safe and is really effective? Is this just some government ploy? We've been fooled before by the federal government. You gave some very cogent instances just a moment ago. Well, or is it the pharmaceutical companies that want to get rich over us? Well, we can address both of those. First of all, the determination of whether a vaccine is truly safe and effective is not made by the company indirectly, and the government doesn't see the data at all until way down the process. The data first come to a totally independent data and safety monitoring board that is made up of experienced clinicians, scientists, vaccinologists, statisticians, and ethicists. They look at the data and they independently determine if it's safe and effective. If it is, they show it to the company. The company then analyzes it and presents it to the FDA and applies for an emergency use authorization or outright approval. The experienced career scientists, not the politicians, the career scientists in the FDA examine the data and then, in association with their own advisory committee, the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, or VRBPAC, those individuals then advise the FDA. When they then say that the vaccine is safe and effective, I will tell you all that I myself will be perfectly comfortable in taking the vaccine, and I would recommend it to my family. So it really is a process of trying to dissect out what the reasons for the skepticism are and to try and address them individually, fully respecting the underlying skepticism that you have every reason to have for historical reasons, to balance those two. That's how I would approach it.
So in that conversation, in what I mentioned earlier, is that there have been advances in society, including African Americans in science. And my understanding is that that independent monitoring board has African American scientists on it. In fact, one works with you directly. I don't know if she's on the board, but we know that we have an African American scientist that works with you directly. And so this is, and talk, you can speak about her work, but also how important that is in terms of breaking down these myths in the historic trepidation, because it's a new day. It's not 1930 anymore. This is 2000. This is 2020. And so the times have changed, and the input of African American scientists in this process is much deeper than one might think. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think the example that you gave, Ambrose, is an excellent example. The very vaccine that's one of the two that has absolutely exquisite level, 94 to 95% efficacy against clinical disease and almost 100% efficacy against serious disease, that has shown to be clearly safe. That vaccine was actually developed in my institute's Vaccine Research Center by a team of scientists led by Dr. Barney Graham and his close colleague, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, or Kizzy Corbett. Kizzy is an African-American scientist who is right at the forefront of the development of the vaccine. So the first thing you might want to say to my African-American brothers and sisters is that the vaccine that you're going to be taking was developed by an African-American woman. And that is just a fact. I mean, that is a fact. And I think that's some of the things that people don't fully appreciate.
Absolutely. And thank you for that information, because one of my residents, as a matter of fact, Mary Douglas Brown, who is 70 years old, lives in Ward 7 in Washington, D.C., had a question where she asked, number one, if I had COVID before, do I still get the vaccine? And let me just explain some of this. She's a breast cancer survivor, and she also has other health conditions, and is kind of worried about taking the vaccine. So number one, if she had COVID, does she take the vaccine still? And two, will it have an impact on some of the other issues of health that she has?
Well, the answer is, even if she's had COVID-19 disease, it is recommended that she does get the vaccine, for the simple reason it is not clear how long immunity to getting infected lasts. Typically, when you get infected, you're immune from reinfection for a period of time. It could be lifelong, like with measles. It could be 10 years or so, as with other diseases, or it could be relatively short. The history of coronaviruses indicates that the durability of immunity is a bit on the short side, measured like maybe in a year or two, and not in decades and decades. So that's the reason why we make no distinction. If a person gets infected and then wants to get the vaccine, it's perfectly fine. It doesn't have any negative impact on other underlying conditions. For example, like the woman who might be a breast cancer survivor.
That's good. No.
Ambrose, if I can jump in here, just as a follow-up question, Dr. Fauci, when people do get the vaccine, what is your anticipation in terms of their ability to return to work, to be out in the community? And what would be your expectation of them in terms of wearing masks, washing their hands, socially distancing until that recommendation goes away, so that people are clear about what type of a panacea and when that panacea is represented in taking a vaccine?
Well, that's a very good question, Dr. Frederick. So first of all, when you get vaccinated, it is very clear of the 30,000 people in the Moderna study and the 44,000 people in the Pfizer study, the incidence of severe adverse events is negligible. So we're not expecting any issues that would interfere with a person's going to work. What the vaccine does have commonly is what we call reactogenicity, which means that a substantial proportion of people will get a sore arm, maybe a bit of aches and feeling a little bit of malaise. A small percentage also gets fever, and that could be uncomfortable, but it's not a large percentage. All of that almost invariably disappears within 24 to 36 hours. So someone might feel a bit uncomfortable about going to work, but generally it doesn't interfere with your function. You take 2 Tylenol and it really, for the most part, takes care of the ache and the feeling of malaise. The second question you ask is that until we get the level of infection in the community to such a low level that it is no longer a threat to anyone, in essence, almost eliminating the threat of infection, that even if you are vaccinated, it is recommended that you follow the public health recommendations of wearing a mask, staying distant, avoiding congregate settings and crowds, and washing your hands often, for a number of reasons. One, you may not be fully protected yourself. And two, the vaccine could prevent you from getting clinical disease, but not necessarily protect you against getting infected. So you could get infected and have absolutely no symptoms, but you might have virus in your nasopharynx, even though you don't have any symptoms. So you want to make sure that you do something like wear a mask, like keep your distance, so you don't inadvertently infect someone else.
Why is there a need for a second dose, booster dose, to make the vaccine effective?
That's just the way the immune system responds. We know from practice and experience that with some types of vaccines, you require a prime, which gets all of those immune cells sort of triggered and ready. Then you come in with a boost and the response really takes off. So based on considerable experience, we know that a prime followed in 28 days by a boost gives you a much more potent and durable response than just a single injection.
Okay. So I have another question from another resident. This one from Dr. Delia Housel, who is a resident in Ward 7, my home ward. And she asked the question, can you describe 2 or 3 performance indicators of success that can be utilized for states to monitor the extent to which COVID-19 vaccination distribution process is successful?
Yeah. Well, a parameter of success is the impact that you have on the dynamics of the outbreak in your community. The most important one that we follow that's a good indication is the test positivity. In other words, what percentage of the people that you test are actually positive? It's a very sensitive measure. So if it goes down by a half of a point or 2 points or more, you can be clear that you are having an impact on the spread of infection in the community. The second, more dramatic, is the level of hospitalizations. And the third, which is even more dramatic, is the level of deaths. So we can monitor the dynamics of the outbreak very, very clearly. And when you do a vaccine program, that's one of the first things that you look at, is that test positivity.
Now, one of the things that has come up, and I want to get your experience on this, is as you have dealt with vaccines and viruses around the world. In your experience in dealing with viruses and vaccines worldwide, I'm sure that you have seen different parts, because you know that there's also kind of an anti-vaccination movement in different parts of the world, including the United States. Based on what you have seen and observed, is it ever appropriate, or when is it appropriate, based on your observation, for children to advocate on their own for a vaccine that their parents wouldn't otherwise allow? And I say that because even under COVID, we've had a little over 1.5 million children that have been infected by COVID. So based on your observations, when would that be appropriate?
You know, it depends obviously on the age of the children, but I think in a child who, has reached the age of reason, as we often have said, and in fact is tuned in enough to know the advantage of vaccine, I think that's something that we have seen in the past. It has generally been individual children who are the children of parents who are anti-vaxxers who've actually said they wanted to. In fact, some children have even had the opportunity to have a lawyer to bring it to court to allow themselves to get vaccinated. I would hope that it doesn't come to that, because I think that could really get kind of messy and confusing and create conflicts that you try to avoid. I would much prefer to try and get to the parents to convince them to allow the children. But in direct answer to your question, Ambrose, that has occurred, and I'm sure it will continue to occur.
This is a follow-up to that question about children. When will we know about the efficacy of the vaccine in children, and of the vaccines that are due for approval within the next couple of weeks? Were children involved in those trials, and were people with health risk involved? Just to speak plainly, I have sickle cell, I'm a type 1 diabetic. Were there people in the trial with health conditions represented for those who may be most concerned about getting severe illness?
Well, let me answer the last question first. Yes, there are people in the trial with the underlying conditions that you're talking about. Not all, because some were excluded because of certain conditions. For example, if you were on a drug like corticosteroids, even though ultimately you would want to have those people to know whether or not they're responding well. But let me get to your important question about when we're going to have children that are going to be able to get vaccinated. In all of vaccinology, there are 2 major groups that we consider the vulnerables, and those are pregnant women and children. And it has been the common practice, for good reason, to before you put vulnerables at risk. You want to make sure you're dealing with a product that is both safe as well as effective in a normal adult population. So once you've established that, which we're almost there in the sense of we've proven it in a trial, and now we're going to start giving it to many, many people, many more than were in the trial. There were like 30,000 and 40,000 in the two trials. By the end of this month, we will have given 40 million doses to 20 million people. So immediately you're going to get a lot of experience. Once you show that, a month or two later, you then do what's called phase 1 trial or a phase 2A trial, either in children or in pregnant women. And what you do is you just need to show that it is safe in the children and that it induces the kind of response that's comparable to the response in the adult that you know protects the adult. And what you do then is what's called a bridging study. You bridge the safety and the immunogenicity data from the children's study to the efficacy data of the adult study, and then you can go ahead and approve the vaccine for the children and then ultimately for pregnant women. So the bottom line is probably a few months into the distribution widely of vaccine to the adult population, we will start distributing it equitably to the population of children.
So when you have a vaccine that is mRNA based, as these are, even though mRNA is not new, but was, to my knowledge, never approved for a vaccine because it was thought to cause inflammation in the body. Has this issue been addressed for the COVID-19 vaccine, or is this considered a minor side effect?
Well, it is considered minor, and that's one of the reasons why you have this reactogenicity that I mentioned a short while ago, where you might get pain at the site, redness, inflammation, achiness, myalgias, and some fatigue, as it were. Rarely you get a fever, but it can occur. That's due to the induction of an inflammatory response by the vaccine candidate. And in this case, that would be the mRNA.
And another question from a resident. How will you ensure that vaccines are distributed in a manner that reaches high-risk populations and high-risk geographic areas first?
Well, the way the vaccine is distributed initially from the factory or the storing house where it's been stored after the fill and finish is by a prorated population-based distribution. Once it gets distributed, and that's done according to Operation Warp Speed by the United States Army, that's responsible only for the transportation, not for the distribution of putting a vaccine in someone's arm. Mm-hmm. Once it gets to the local site, the state and local health authorities are responsible for the equitable distribution within their particular jurisdiction. And we're relying on the community people in those areas to make sure that there is equitable distribution. It isn't centrally mandated, it's locally controlled.
Very good, very good.
And just to follow up on that, Dr. Fauci, African Americans have been disproportionately impacted. And to give you some data, there are about 700,000 citizens in DC. And when you look at Ward 7 and 8, where Mr. Lane is from, there clearly has been a disproportionate impact. DC has been allocated 8,000 doses of the vaccine in this first round. How, as you work with the president-elect and the vice president-elect, who I have to mention is one of my alumni, and you try to push that vaccine out, how are you going to ensure that it gets to those who most need it? And how can we, as a community, assist in ensuring that it gets to where it has to go to?
Well, Dr. Frederick, I think the last thing you just said is the answer. I think if the community activists, the people in the community, should hold the feet to the fire of those individuals who are going to be responsible for the distribution, to make sure that that distribution is fair and equitable. I hope that it would happen anyway, but I think if you keep a close eye on it, it would more likely happen if they know that people are looking to make sure that it is fair and equitable.
So let me just say to Dr. Frederick, he's not the only one that can claim the vice president-elect as alumna. And in fact, she was in school in undergrad at the same time that I was in school in undergrad. I don't think we crossed paths, but it's just good to know that she was in school at the same time that I was in school. And let me just act and talk about this issue of equity, because one of these issues, and you said that states are the ones that are going to determine the distribution, and that's really important to know, because it means that in those states there needs to be enough advocacy at the ground level to talk about where the vaccine should go and distribute it in a way that really addresses the community need. Let me ask you a question about community voice, and congratulations on being selected as the Vice President-elect's Chief Medical Officer. Thank you for that. And so, what do you view as the need for community voice, even up the chain, in terms of COVID-19 and the response of the federal government?
Yeah, I mean, this is not just, Ambrose, for COVID-19. I have been back in the days and continue to today of my intensive involvement with diseases like HIV/AIDS. Yes. I have always been a very strong advocate, a vocal advocate for the role of community in the distribution of resources for diseases, whatever they may be it HIV/AIDS, the way it was in the 80s and the 90s, when I was actively doing that every day, or today with COVID-19. I'm a very strong advocate of community involvement.
Dr. Frederick?
We're getting questions from a national audience. We actually now have folks from all over the country listening in to this very important dialogue. So with that in mind, to broaden some of the questions around the vaccine, there are obviously dozens of vaccines being brought to market, or at least researchers are working on those. And so we anticipate that those will be processed, and the FDA, as we mentioned before, will be looking at those. What is your expectation in terms of how long it will take to get enough of us to have the vaccine to really suppress, if not eradicate, the level of infection that we've been seeing surging?
Yeah, well, take the United States. The federal government has contracted with 6 vaccine companies to make vaccines involving 3 separate vaccine platforms. Right now, I would project, and I think it's pretty accurate projection, that we will get the people who are designated as high priority people. We will get them vaccinated likely by March. As we go from March onward into April, there will be what I refer to as open season, in the sense of anybody who is not a high priority, the normal 30-year-old healthy man or woman, somebody in Ward 7 maybe, who's got no underlying conditions, that as we get into April, that those people will start to get vaccinated. If we get a good uptake of vaccine and we convince the people who are reluctant to get vaccinated, and we vaccinate 75% of the population, then I believe that by the time we get to the middle to end of the summer, we will have that veil of protection, that we will be able to approach a strong degree of normality. But it's going to be really dependent on how many people get vaccinated. That's the reason why I put such emphasis on convincing the people who are skeptical and reticent to get vaccinated to understand why it's important, not only for your own individual health, but for the entire community, because you are part of the community. And if you get vaccinated, you are contributing to the boxing in of that virus so that it's not going to infect anyone. So it really is not only an individual, it's a societal responsibility to get vaccinated.
And in the interim, until we get there, what types of treatments, medications, and interventions have come to pass? Everybody has obviously gotten very focused on the vaccine, but in the interim, you just described months where people will still be getting infected and still need interventions. Any new interventions or any improvement in the treatment of the coronavirus infection that you want to share with us?
Yes. Well, I think just in general, generically, Dr. Frederick, is that as in any disease, I am sure you experience in that yourself, the more people you see with it, the better you get at treating. So notwithstanding any specific therapy, our ability to treat people now in December of 2020 is much better than when it was in January and February, just on the basis of knowing what works and knowing what doesn't work. The specific therapies, I must say, we have better and more effective therapies for people with advanced disease than we do with people early in the course of disease. There are a lot of experimental drugs. There's convalescent plasma that has an EUA. The data don't look overwhelmingly good, but we still need to do randomized placebo-controlled trials. We have two companies with 3 monoclonal antibodies that have been approved through an EUA, the Lilly product and the Regeneron product. We're working on hyperimmune globulin. And those are the things early on. We're also trying to look at some small molecule antivirals. What I would think was the most desirable thing is to do drug development for a combination of direct antivirals similar to what we had with HIV/AIDS, with the protease and the integrase and the reverse transcriptase inhibitors. If we can get those for COVID-19, we'd really be in good shape. But it's for advanced disease, it's very, very interesting that we have found that a drug that we've all used a lot, dexamethasone, that when you give 6 milligrams of dexamethasone for 5 to 10 days in a row in someone who's either on a ventilator or who has a high flow oxygen requirement, that you can diminish dramatically the 28-day mortality. So simple as common as a glucocorticoid can do it.
Now, we are in the middle of a surge as we speak. What is your prognosis? It almost seems like there doesn't seem to be an end to this surge right now, and we haven't even gotten deep into the flu season yet. That's the first question, because it is a little frightening for people. The second question would be, if people participate in vaccine studies, is there a long-term provision for healthcare? Because, of course, the disproportionate access to healthcare is an issue in the African-American community. And so would there be long-term provision for healthcare and financial benefit?
Let me answer your last question first, Ambrose. Disappointingly, there's not. So there isn't special provisions for people who don't already have healthcare capabilities. So it isn't something special about taking a vaccine unless there's an injury associated with the vaccine. That's a different story. But just because you're participating in a vaccine trial, there aren't special considerations for healthcare if you happen to get an unrelated disease. That's the first thing. So with regard to your first question, I'm sorry, would you repeat it again?
We seem to be in the middle of...
Yes, I got it. Yeah. So we are in a tough situation because our baseline level of infections before this fall surge that we have was unacceptably high to begin with. We were at anywhere between 40 and 70,000 new cases per day. The combination of the colder weather, what's driving people to do things indoor more than outdoor, even innocent social family and friends gathering has now been shown to be an important source of spread, usually from an asymptomatic person who doesn't even know they're infected. We have not yet seen the full blunt of the Thanksgiving holiday, which combines travel with congregating at family and friends meeting, usually 2.5 weeks following the Thanksgiving or any event, in this case, the Thanksgiving holiday. You see a spike in cases. We already have a steep inflection of cases. When you superimpose the Thanksgiving spike, you have what I call a surge upon a surge. That is going to land about a week before we start to travel for the Christmas holidays and Hanukkah, which would mean we have almost a double whammy. Wow. Because just as you're surging, people travel for Christmas, they congregate at parties, at social gatherings, at dinners. Then the Christmas spike is going to be another one. So the months of December and January are going to be very problematic. And we shouldn't raise our hands in despair and say, there's nothing we can do about it. What we need to do is to say we're going to double down on mitigation methods, wearing of masks, physical separation, avoiding congregate settings. And we're going to be asking people to do something that is difficult and maybe even painful, particularly at the family level, is to tell people, unless it's absolutely necessary, not to travel. We said that over Thanksgiving, and we're saying the same thing over Christmas. If you can at all get away from travel, being at airports, being at crowded train stations, try and stay at home with your family unit, as difficult as it may be, because everybody wants to be social and socialize during the holiday season. It's better to say this is an unusual year. Hopefully we're going to have a lot more Christmases, a lot more New Year's. Let me just cool it for this time because this is a very unique situation. That's what we're recommending for people to do.
Dr. Fauci, you mentioned that this happened very quickly. And I think that the medical collaboration that occurred here amongst and all of the scientific collaboration is going to be historic and will be written about for years to come. But I think one of the concerns that people have is, will there be long-term effects of taking this vaccine that may not show up for 5-10 years down the road? And if not, or if the probability is low, why would you think so?
That's a great question, Wayne. The probability is very low for the following reason. When you look at the history of vaccinology, more than 95% or more of what you would consider intermediate or longer term issues with a vaccine with regard to adverse effects, more than 90 to 95% of them occur within 30 to 45 days following the vaccination. And for that reason, the FDA, in order to issue an EUA, must wait 60 full days from the time that 50% of the people who got the vaccine got their last dose. So even right now, as we begin to distribute the vaccine, history tells us that 95% of all the adverse events will have already occurred. So the chances are extraordinarily low that there's going to be a significant degree of effects that you'll see 1 year or 2 years from now. We just don't see that with vaccines historically, and there's no reason to believe that we're going to see it with the COVID-19 vaccine.
And Dr. Fauci, I want to circle back to the initial issue of trust, because you've given us a wealth of information, and I want to thank you for that. One of the things that the Black Coalition Against COVID has done has been to engage the historic Black colleges and universities, in particular the 4 Black medical schools, Howard University, Morehouse, Meharry, and Drew. And we did that for a very specific reason, because they are trusted institutions within the Black community. And now that there are vaccine trials taking place at some of those institutions, we are still trying to encourage the African American community to participate in those trials. But the issue of trust will obviously go beyond that. And so relationships, as you know, they matter. And so relationships with those universities and with community organizations like my own, with institutions like the NIH, or with pharmaceutical companies, becomes critical when it comes to building trust. What would you suggest, and what advice do you have in terms of developing those relationships? Does it need to be in a more formal way, maybe through the efforts of the Biden administration or the coming Biden administration, or are there more informal methods of developing those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, you have to make a concerted effort to reach out to establish and forge relationships. But the one thing we've learned, it's really a multi-year process. Yeah. You don't decide, well, we have a little bit of a crisis, we want to get a COVID-19 vaccines, let's start developing relationships with the African American community and the people in the classically Black African American medical schools and other institutions of higher learning. You've got to start now. And what we do now is going to bear fruits 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now. I mean, we note that ourselves in our own collaborations, that they take time to mature. And that's what you want. You want mature relationships that are built on trust. That just takes time. So it's a matter of go for it, start it now, and know that it's going to be a multi-year process.
And before, as we get ready to wrap up and I turn it over to Dr. Frederick, I did notice what looks like a baseball jersey in your background. Was that a jersey that you wore? I'm a baseball fan. So
no, actually, Ambrose, what that is that when I threw out my unsuccessful first pitch at the opening day of the Washington Nationals, they gave me a national jersey with my name on it. As you might see, each of the players signed it. So all those little black squiggles there on the entire Washington National. I felt very badly that I blew it.
Well, but you know, you're throwing the pitch now for all of our medical and health lives. So you're throwing strikes when it comes to that. So
I hope so.
Thank you, sir.
And Dr. Fauci, before I close, I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak directly to our audience. We've had thousands of listeners. This will be replayed. We have a town hall coming up on Thursday. We hope people will join us through the National Urban League Facebook Live. We're going to keep at this. There are events that the Black Coalition Against COVID will also host in the coming new year. I'd like to give you a last opportunity to address the African community directly about the need to participate in clinical trials for the vaccine and some assurance that taking a vaccine at this stage would be safe. And then I will close.
Well, thank you, Wayne. I appreciate the opportunity. You know, I've thought about this a lot and deeply. And I understand, as you said in the beginning of the hour, of the historical reason why there's skepticism in the Black African American community about engaging in any medical type of an endeavor particularly one that seems to be run by the United States federal government. The terrible and shameful things that happened a long time ago were inexcusable. It would be doubly tragic if the lingering effect of that prevents you from doing something now that's so important for your individual health, the health of your families, and the health of your communities. So fully understanding the reason for skepticism, the time now is to put skepticism aside so that you can take advantage of the advances in biomedical research and health that you deserve, because you've been through things that were very unfortunate in the past. Let's get you now in the front of the line to get the advances that are now available to everybody. They should not be deprived of the African American community because of things and reasons that were before your time and beyond your control. So get with the program, help yourself. You'll be saving yourself and your family illness as well as that of your community. So that's my final message, and thank you for allowing me to give it.
So as we close first, Dr. Fauci, let me tell you, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you very, very much for all that you've done for this nation in the middle of this crisis. I know in our society today, we hold up our heroes in so many different ways. But certainly, you are a modern day hero for all of us, and we are extremely humbled by your example. And so I want to thank you personally for all that you've done for the nation. I want to thank the Black Coalition Against COVID. The demonstration of bringing a community organization together with academics on this level is critical, and I think is a very good example of what we can do if we all come together and work very, very hard in order to solve what are very challenging problems. What I heard tonight, and I think the takeaways that we all should keep in mind, is that this is a very challenging problem. There's no doubt. The manufacturing of these two vaccines, the production of them is complicated, and it has happened in record time. Having said that, there are protections set up in our system to ensure that these vaccines will be safe. It is imperative that members of the Black community participate in the clinical trials and get this vaccine in order to continue to protect all of us, is what we heard from Dr. Fauci tonight. We heard from Ambrose Lane that in the community, there are concerns, but the best way to quell those concerns is to make sure that we have direct conversations like this. And on Thursday at 6 p.m., the Black Coalition Against COVID, in conjunction with the National Urban League and others, will host another direct town hall about the vaccine and continue to answer your questions. The 4 Black medical schools will continue to participate in the science and the clinical trials. As you can see from the banner below, there is information on how you can participate in clinical trials. You'll find that on the websites as well. And so we encourage you to do that. We want to thank BlackDoctor.org for their assistance throughout this and their partnership throughout this pandemic as we continue to try to bring information to you. I want to take a special privilege to thank Dr. Reed Tuckson, who is one of the co-founders of the Black Coalition Against COVID, for his tireless work to ensure that our community is safe and continues to be protected. Mark Morial from the National Urban League couldn't be with us tonight as he had a meeting with the transition team, and so we understand that. So in closing again, please be safe. As you heard from Dr. Fauci, limit your travel over the holidays. Let us work together to eradicate this disease and protect our community. So we wish you happy holidays and a very safe and happy new year. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you.